Hello, friend. Welcome to Soft History Stories. Picture this: a gray dawn over a medieval town, the kind of morning where the sun feels too tired to rise. The streets are slick with last night's rain, a slow stew of mud, manure, and ambition. Smoke seeps from crooked chimneys, curling around stone towers and wooden stalls where merchants yawn beside barrels of fish and sacks of grain. A beggar kneels in the road, hands trembling, while a nobleman strides past, his boots polished so bright they reflect the misery beneath them. The beggar whispers a blessing. The nobleman doesn't hear it. Or maybe he does and simply doesn't care. This was the Middle Ages, an age of castles and cathedrals, of plagues and pilgrimages, where incense burned to disguise the smell of sweat, and prayer was often just another form of currency. Everything and everyone had a price land: loyalty, even salvation. The poor prayed for bread. The rich prayed not to become the poor. And between them stretched a system so deeply rigged that even God, if he were listening, might have sighed at the paperwork. Forget what the storybooks told you about gallant knights and noble kings. Medieval riches weren't earned by chivalry or charity. They were taken, tricked, or taxed. Gold wasn't mined so much as squeezed from the hands of the desperate. Power was a business, and business was war dressed in velvet. To be rich in the Middle Ages was to be untouchable, not because you were holy, but because you owned everyone who said you were. But the real story isn't about the nobles at all. It's about the others, the dreamers, the desperate, the ones born into mud and determined to crawl their way toward marble. Because while the church preached humility and kings demanded loyalty, a few clever souls learned the real gospel of the age. Greed works if you're patient enough. A merchant with the right gamble could outlive 10 knights. A monk with the right vineyard could rival a duke. And a banker with the right client, well, he could lend money to God's own representative and charge interest for forgiveness. So tonight, we're not counting fairy tale treasures or dragon hoards. We're counting the very real, often brutal, ways people clawed their way to fortune in a world where being poor was a sentence, not a stage. Some fought for it, some prayed for it. So me traded spices, souls, or swords. And a rare few, the smartest, the luckiest, or perhaps the most ruthless, actually made it. Take a slow breath. Let the torches dim. Listen for the toll of distant church bells, calling both peasants and princes to remember who owned what and who never would. In this world, poverty was eternal, but greed was a strategy. So get comfortable, my friend. Pour yourself something warm, and let's step back into a time when money didn't just talk, it ruled. And if you're still awake by the end, like, share, and subscribe. Because the richest lessons in history are always best told slowly. The bells fade into distance, leaving behind a low hum that feels older than the stones themselves. Somewhere, a rooster crows late, a sound far less noble than the poets pretend, and in that moment, the rhythm of the Middle Ages begins again, the grinding wheel of hierarchy turning, creaking, but never stopping. The poor stay poor, the rich stay crowned. That was not cynicism, it was structure. The medieval world was a pyramid built from human bodies, the peasants forming the broad, muddy base. The nobles and priests perched comfortably at the top, their robes and rings gleaming with the sweat of everyone beneath them. If you were born at the bottom, you stayed there, not because you lacked ambition, but because the system was designed to make your ambition look like sin. God, they said, had chosen everyone's place in life, and to question it was to question his will. It was a convenient theology, especially for those enjoying divine favor. A lord's comfort came wrapped in the illusion of destiny, while the peasant's suffering was explained away as spiritual training. You plowed the earth, you paid your tithe, you died. And if you were lucky, you'd die under a roof rather than under the open sky. Every castle towered not just over the land, but over the lives tied to it. For the peasant, the Lord's banner on the hill was both shield and shackle. He offered protection, but only from enemies he himself provoked. He granted you land, but not ownership. You worked it, bled into it, raised children on it, and when you died, the same soil swallowed you without ceremony. The world's wealth was measured not in coins, but in control, and control always flowed upward. Picture it: a countryside stitched together by manors, each one a miniature kingdom, each ruled by someone whose greatest labor was signing documents and attending feasts. The nobles called themselves protectors of the realm, though what they mostly protected was the idea that God liked them better. And above them all the king, the sun in this feudal cosmos, the man to whom every oath, tax, and dream of advancement pointed. To the medieval mind, the king's riches were not stolen from the people. They were proof that the world was working as intended. Below, the villagers prayed. They prayed for rain when the fields cracked, and for mercy when the collectors came. They prayed for a life that was not so short, and a death that was not so hungry. But prayer was currency too, and even that was taxed. The church, guardian of souls, made certain that sin could be forgiven for a price. And so, while the nobles collected crops, the priests collected guilt, and both ended up rich. It was a perfect system, polished by centuries of repetition, where even the illusion of fairness had been exiled. There was no middle class, no merchant comfort or urban dream for most. You were born into your place like you were born into your skin. The son of a farmer became a farmer. The daughter of a washerwoman scrubbed until her fingers split. The only difference between life and death was whether someone remembered to pay for your coffin. And yet, even in this iron hierarchy, there flickered a small, dangerous idea that there might be a way out. That somewhere between the sword, the sermon, and the silver coin lay a path towards something better. But those paths were narrow and cruel. To rise through fighting meant gambling your body on the battlefield. To rise through prayer meant surrendering your name to the church and hoping God enjoyed obedience. To rise through trade meant walking a road where failure could cost you your life, and success could paint a target on your back. These were the escape routes: fight, pray, or sell something, maybe even your soul. For most, however, the dream of wealth was just another bedtime story told by candlelight. The village would whisper of some peasant boy who caught the favor of a lord, or a soldier who won land for bravery, or a merchant whose ship returned heavy with spice. They were stories of miracles, not plans, and yet every generation kept hoping, because hope was the only thing the rich couldn't tax. The divide between the haves and the have-nots wasn't just social, it was physical. Step into any medieval town, and you could tell who was who by scent alone. The rich smelled of lavender, of imported oils, of clean linen aired by servants. The poor smelled of smoke, mud, and the sour persistence of labor. The wealthy lived uphill, quite literally, where the waste didn't flow. The poor lived where the rivers stank and the rats ran fat. Even the air obeyed the pyramid, and yet this imbalance was not chaos. It was order, cruel, sacred, and self-sustaining. Feudalism was not built to reward effort. It was built to preserve power. The nobles lent their swords to the king. The church lent its blessing, and the peasants lent everything else. When a war broke out, the peasants paid for it. When peace returned, they paid for that too. The system survived because everyone believed it had to, because to imagine change was to invite danger. Still, within that vast, unmoving world, a few dared to reach higher. A clever monk might notice that the church owned more grain than God required. A knight might realize that ransoms were more profitable than honor. A peasant might save enough to buy a stall in town, to trade, to risk, to dream. These were rare sparks of ambition flickering against centuries of darkness. But for the great majority, history passed like the seasons, predictable, merciless, and indifferent. The crops grew or failed, the taxes rose or fell. You were born beneath the same Lord who had ruled your parents, and you died beneath his son. Your name never left the parish register. Your bones fed the same soil that starved you. And still the system turned. smooth as a millstone, grinding lives into grain for the powerful to feast upon. That was the truth of the Middle Ages, not the shining tournaments or pious prayers carved in marble, but the slow, grinding certainty that the game was fixed before you were even born. The rich didn't just win, they rewrote the rules so winning was their birthright. The rest simply tried to stay alive long enough to watch them do it. So, when we speak of getting rich in this world, remember it wasn't just about gold. It was about escaping gravity, defying the weight of centuries pressing you down, and most never did. But a few, a very lucky, very ruthless few, found ways to climb that impossible pyramid, one muddy step at a time. And that's where our story continues. Among those rare souls who decided that God's plan could use a little revision, and that perhaps, just perhaps, greed was the only prayer worth answering. The pyramid of power did not stand by accident. It stood because it was blessed, sharpened, and sustained by what medieval thinkers called the three estates of man, a holy trinity of labor, blood, and prayer. Those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. The formula was so perfect, so cruelly balanced, that it lasted nearly 1,000 years without ever pretending to be fair. Each estate had its place, its uniform, and its function. Together they made up the machinery of the Middle Ages, running on faith, fear, and the sweat of 1,000,000 backs. At the top, or at least very near the top, stood those who prayed the clergy, the guardians of souls, the translators between earth and heaven. They claimed no armies and carried no swords. Yet they wielded a kind of power that even kings envied, authority over eternity. A noble might rule your body, but the church ruled your afterlife, and eternity was a long time to gamble with. The priest's robe was a subtle armor, his sermon a contract. You didn't argue with him, not because he was always right, but because he held the keys to something you couldn't afford to lose. The church was everywhere, in the chapel by the field, in the cathedral that shadowed the town square, in the whispered blessings over bread. And like all good institutions, it was as much an economic system as a spiritual one. Every harvest brought a tithe. Every death required a fee for burial. Every sin, a small transaction in the currency of forgiveness. Salvation came with a receipt. Even monasteries, those quiet sanctuaries of prayer and parchment, were financial empires in disguise, owning land, mills, breweries, and herds. They produced beer, bread, manuscripts, and money. To the medieval mind, this made sense. God rewarded the righteous with prosperity, and so the church's wealth was proof of its holiness. The poorer you were, the more sinful you must have been, a neat piece of logic that kept donations flowing upward. Of course, a few skeptics noticed the contradiction. When peasants starved while bishops dined from gold plates, the phrase God's will was used more as insurance than explanation. But faith was the cement of the age. To doubt too loudly was to risk both your body and your soul. If the clergy ruled the spirit, the nobility ruled the flesh. They were the ones who fought knights, lords, and barons, who claimed their right to violence as others claimed their right to prayer. They were born to command, bred for battle, and trained to believe that their superiority was not learned but inherited. Their lives were governed by the code of chivalry, that glittering ideal of courage, loyalty, and protection of the weak. It sounded noble. It looked even better on a tapestry, but behind the poetry was business. War was not merely a duty. It was an investment. Every campaign promised spoils, land, titles, and ransom. A captured noble could bring in more profit than a merchant's lifetime of trade. A successful siege could fund a dynasty. Even honor had a price, an economy of blood where valor could be exchanged for property. And so the knight, that shining figure of medieval romance, was also a kind of stockbroker, his fortunes rising and falling with the chaos of war. Yet not every noble was rich, and not every knight was shining. Many were perpetually indebted to armorers, to their squires, to their lords, and often to the church. Their estates might be grand in name, but hollow in coin. A castle could look impressive while its kitchen starved. Still, nobility was wealth in its purest symbolic form. Even a poor baron was richer than any free peasant, because he owned what mattered most, other people's obedience. And then, below them all, came those who worked the peasants, the serfs, the ones who kept the whole system breathing while barely surviving themselves. Their hands turned the soil, their backs bent under taxes, their lives measured by harvests and hunger. To be born a peasant was to inherit exhaustion. There were no titles to inherit, no armor to wear, no altars to preach, from only the endless rhythm of dawn, labor, and sleep. The division was sacred, or so everyone was told. The clergy prayed for all. The nobles fought for all. The peasants worked for all. A divine balance, they said, except that one group prayed in cathedrals of marble, another feasted in castles of stone, and the third slept in huts of mud. If a peasant dared to question the fairness of this design, he was reminded that labor itself was holy, that to work and suffer was to imitate Christ. Somehow, the Christ who suffered never seemed to own as many fields as the bishop who preached it. The truth, of course, was that the three estates were less a partnership than a hierarchy dressed in theology. The church and the nobility needed each other, and both needed the peasants to keep quiet. The priests promised divine legitimacy for the nobles' authority. The nobles protected the church's property. Together, they formed an alliance so seamless that rebellion became unthinkable. The social order was painted as cosmic, a mirror of heaven itself, where God ruled over angels, and angels over men. To defy your station was to disturb the celestial order, and no one wanted to be blamed for that. In towns where new trades and crafts began to bloom, a few daring souls tried to slip between the lines. Merchants, blacksmiths, and moneylenders, people who belonged to no estate, but carved out a place through cunning and luck. To the old guard, they were suspicious, almost unnatural. How could wealth come from anything other than land or God? The answer, as it turned out, was work, but the kind of work that made people nervous, because it didn't fit neatly into the sacred triangle. Yet even this small hint of change did not shake the foundations. The world remained divided, not just by birth, but by belief. Nobles thanked God for their privilege, priests thanked him for his providence, and peasants thanked him for not letting them die sooner. Everyone agreed the system was holy, because everyone was afraid of what might happen if it wasn't. To live in that time was to inhabit a map already drawn. You could not redraw it, only navigate the small paths between survival and starvation. The road to wealth, if you were not born to it, required miracles of courage or cunning. You could pray your way into a monastery, fight your way into knighthood, or trade your way into suspicion. Each path was narrow, dangerous, and lined with corpses of those who tried. And yet, the brilliance of the medieval order lay in how convincing it was. People believed in it because it made sense of their suffering. The noble bled on the battlefield so the peasant could till in peace. The priest prayed for everyone's soul, even if his own hands stayed clean. The peasant worked for all, because someone had to. It was a triangle of necessity, disguised as divine harmony. Everyone had a purpose, and that purpose was to keep the wheel turning. In such a world, wealth was not only possession, it was divine approval. To be rich was to be favored by God. To be poor was to be tested by him. And so, generation after generation, the myth endured, gilded by faith and polished by repetition. It was not an economy, it was theology written in taxes. And still, somewhere under that smooth surface of obedience, ambition stirred. A monk eyeing the abbot's chair, a peasant saving a few coins beneath the floorboards, a knight counting the ransom of a captured lord and wondering if heaven would forgive his arithmetic. The hierarchy stood, but within it, small cracks appeared, the kind that grow wider with every sermon, every sword, every sigh. Because for all its divine symmetry, the medieval order could not silence human desire. The poor still dreamed, the rich still hungered for more, And even the priests, those sworn to poverty, still reached for gold when the offering plate came near. The holy trinity of the medieval world had kept peace for centuries, but peace was never meant to last. Beneath the prayer, the fighting, and the work, the whisper of greed was already echoing. And soon, that whisper would become the chant of a new age, an age where people would start asking not how to serve, but how to profit. If the church ruled the soul, and the nobles ruled the sword, then the king ruled everything else, or at least, he liked to think so. The medieval king was not merely a man with a crown. He was the gravitational center of the entire social order. Every field, every coin, every heartbeat of the realm technically belonged to him. The phrase, "the king's peace," didn't mean tranquility, it meant control. His word was law, his name was currency, and his appetite was endless. In a world built on hierarchy, he was the top of the pyramid, and everyone else existed to keep him comfortable, glorified, and solvent. But being king was not a matter of leisure. It was a profession, and a dangerous one at that. To sit on the throne was to balance constantly between divine right and very human rage. You were God's chosen, yes, but also the most obvious target for every angry peasant, bankrupt, noble, and ambitious cousin. A medieval crown was a fragile thing, held together with flattery, fear, and taxation. The king's wealth came not from invention or effort, but from ownership, the total, unquestioned possession of land. Every acre of soil, from the richest vineyards to the muddiest pig pens, technically belonged to the crown. The lords merely borrowed it, paying their rent in loyalty and soldiers. Peasants worked that same land, feeding the chain that fed the king. When harvests were good, his treasury grew heavy. When they failed, his ministers found new ways to invent taxes. The art of taxation was medieval alchemy, turning toil into gold without ever touching a plow. There were taxes for land, taxes for war, taxes for peace, taxes for dying, and even taxes for not dying fast enough. The king taxed mills, bridges, markets, and marriages. He taxed the right to brew beer, to bake bread, to own a window that let in light. In France, kings taxed salt so heavily that people risked death just to smuggle it. In England, kings taxed wool, then taxed the merchants who sold it, then taxed the roads the merchants used to carry it. Each coin that landed in the royal chest came with a story of suffering. But in the royal ledger, numbers mattered more than names. The king's motto might as well have been, "I exist, therefore you owe." War, of course, was the most lucrative business of all. Victory, as one chronicler put it, was taxation by sword. Every campaign was both a holy mission and a financial opportunity. To conquer meant to collect. A successful war brought plunder, land, and prisoners who could be ransomed back for profit. Defeated nobles forfeited their estates. Rebel towns were fined into submission. A single triumph could refill the treasury overnight if the king lived long enough to enjoy it. And yet, greed was a double-edged sword. For every monarch who enriched his realm, there were others who taxed themselves into rebellion. A hungry peasantry could be patient, but not forever. When taxes became unbearable, the same hands that once harvested wheat began to sharpen pitchforks. History remembers more than a few kings who mistook obedience for loyalty, only to learn that loyalty was rented, not owned. Take, for example, King John of England, remembered less for ruling and more for losing everything that could be lost. Obsessed with squeezing money from his barons, he imposed taxes on their lands, their inheritances, even their marriages. The nobles, tired of paying for his failures in France, eventually cornered him at Runnymede and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, not a love letter to democracy, but a collective "stop robbing us" note. John signed it, fumed, and promptly ignored it. But the damage was done. The idea that even kings could be held accountable, that their greed had limits, was born in ink and resentment. Elsewhere, in France, Philip IV perfected the art of royal opportunism. When he ran out of money, he didn't raise taxes, he changed the game. He expelled the Jews, and seized their assets, then accused the Knights Templar of heresy and took their gold too. It worked, briefly. But divine punishment has a sense of irony. Philip died soon after, his dynasty collapsing within a generation. It turned out that stealing from the church might fill your treasury, but it drained your luck. And yet, some monarchs managed the balancing act brilliantly. They understood that a king's wealth was less about what he took and more about what people believed he deserved to take. Basil II of Byzantium, for example, ruled for nearly 50 years without lavish banquets or golden fleets. He hoarded silver like a dragon hoards fire, funding fortresses and armies instead of palaces. By the time he died, the empire was so rich it survived generations without new income. His frugality became legend not as stinginess, but as strength. He proved that in the Middle Ages, discipline could be more powerful than greed. But such kings were rare. Most could not resist the temptation to live like gods among mortals. They built towers that reached the clouds, dined from plates of gold, and bathed in wine, while their subjects drank water brown with dirt. Every royal excess was justified as divine right. After all, who were the peasants to question God's favorite? The problem, of course, was that peasants had a habit of dying inconveniently, and dead subjects pay no taxes. So, to maintain this delicate balance, the king relied on an army of collectors and sheriffs, men whose job it was to turn loyalty into revenue. These were the faces of monarchy the common folk actually saw grim, dusty riders demanding payment in His Majesty's name. They carried parchment rolls and iron purses, and they were universally despised. But they were necessary, for the crown's hunger never stopped. In truth, medieval kings were less like gods and more like gamblers. Their fortunes rose and fell with every harvest, every rebellion, every war. One victory could make them legendary. One winter could ruin them. Their thrones rested on gold, but gold melted fast. A single failed campaign or a careless alliance could empty the coffers overnight. And when the money ran out, the crown turned predatory again, clawing whatever wealth remained from those who could least afford it. It is tempting, from a modern distance, to imagine that royal luxury was stable, that the man in the crown slept easy. But that was rarely the case. Behind the feasts and tapestries lay sleepless nights, ledgers of debt, and whispers of discontent. Every tax was a risk, every war a wager. Power was rented from fortune, and fortune was fickle. The king, in all his splendor, was as much a prisoner as his peasants. He was trapped in expectation to appear rich, to act invincible, to feed the machine he embodied. A frugal monarch looked weak, a generous one looked desperate. Somewhere, between greed and survival, between divine right and mortal danger, the medieval king walked a tightrope strung over centuries. Some crossed it gracefully, many fell. Still, the crown endured, passed from father to son, polished and bloodied in equal measure. The royal treasury might empty, but the idea of kingship never did. For in the Middle Ages, wealth was not just measured in silver, it was measured in obedience. And as long as peasants bowed, nobles paid homage, and priests offered blessings, the king remained the richest man alive. But beneath that glittering illusion lay an unspoken truth. His kingdom was only as stable as the silence of the people below. And silence, as every monarch eventually learned, was the most expensive commodity of all. By the time most kings had drunk their fortunes dry or buried them under marble, Basil II of Byzantium was quietly counting his coins in silence. He ruled for nearly half a century, but his story was not one of golden feasts or jeweled crowns. It was a chronicle of restraint, a man who believed that the true power of gold lay not in spending it, but in not spending it. The world knew him as Basil the Bulgar Slayer, a warrior who crushed enemies and expanded borders. But his greatest conquest was not of land or people, it was of greed. When Basil ascended to the throne in the late 10th century, the Byzantine Empire was vast, glittering, and dangerously hollow. The nobles grew fat on luxury. Generals schemed in silk, and the treasury, once the envy of the world, was leaking silver faster than it could be mined. The empire, for all its splendor, was rotting from indulgence. Basil, however, was not a man born for indulgence. He had no patience for poets or courtiers, no interest in the shimmer of ceremony. While his predecessors lounged under mosaics, Basil spent his youth in armor, his eyes hardened by the cold light of the battlefield. He inherited not just an empire, but a debt and a court that thought thrift was a form of barbarism. Where others saw glory in extravagance, he saw weakness. He walked through his palaces with the suspicion of a man inspecting a sinking ship, taking mental notes of every wasted coin. He dismissed half the servants, reduced the feasts to rations, and wore the same cloak until the fabric frayed like parchment. When courtiers whispered that such behavior was unfit for an emperor, Basil simply ignored them. He had no need for their approval, only their obedience. While other rulers built pleasure gardens, Basil built fortresses. Where others hosted tournaments, he drilled soldiers. His empire became a machine of discipline, fueled not by opulence but by efficiency. He understood something most monarchs never learned. Gold is not strength until it's spent wisely. So he spent little and saved much, an emperor of iron taste and iron will. He fought wars not for trophies but for permanence. Against the Bulgarians, he waged a campaign so relentless that it became legend, a decades-long struggle that ended in the complete submission of a rival kingdom. When his soldiers brought him the spoils of victory, jewels, silks, and slaves, he took none for himself. The treasure went straight into the imperial vaults, where it gathered like a silent army of coins. By the end of his reign, those vaults bulged with unimaginable wealth. Silver stacked in walls, gold packed in casks, treasures untouched by human hand. It was said that the empire could survive for decades on Basil's savings alone, and indeed, it did. His stinginess became mythic, but also strategic. He paid his soldiers not in promises but in coin, ensuring their loyalty when other emperors' armies rebelled. He funded fortifications that outlasted generations. He even refused to marry, fearing that heirs and empresses would drain his treasury with their appetites. To his courtiers, he was cold. To his accountants, divine. Every copper piece mattered. The empire under Basil was not a place of ease. Taxes were harsh, spending was scrutinized, and luxury was treated like sin. Nobles grumbled as their privileges were cut. Merchants cursed his regulations, and even priests complained that he donated less to the church than any ruler before him. But Basil's gaze never wavered. He believed comfort was the first step toward collapse. A fat court, he said, made a thin empire. So he starved it deliberately, not of food, but of decadence. Yet, for all his austerity, Basil's reign was not one of misery. His people, though taxed and disciplined, lived under stability. Roads were safe, the borders secure, and the treasury, that eternal measure of an empire's heartbeat, was full. He ruled not by charm or divine theater, but by consistency. His motto could have been carved into the very walls of Constantinople: spend little, fear nothing. It's tempting to imagine him in the evening, sitting alone in the imperial palace, the flicker of oil lamps dancing across the mosaics of saints and soldiers. Outside, the city of Constantinople hummed with merchants and monks, with storytellers and sailors, with all the glitter of an empire that seemed eternal. But inside his chamber, there would be no music, no wine, no laughter, only ledgers, maps, and silence. He lived not as a god-king, but as a custodian, guarding the wealth of centuries like a dragon too pragmatic to ever sleep. When he died in 1025, his empire was at its zenith, vast, orderly, and rich beyond imagination. The vaults were said to hold over 200,000 pounds of gold, a fortune so great that it kept Byzantium afloat for generations. His successors spent it all, of course. Within 50 years, the treasury was empty, the nobles fat again, and the empire trembling on its golden foundations. But for a brief, brilliant time, Basil had proven that restraint could be more powerful than conquest. In a world that worshipped opulence, he turned austerity into art. He did not need a golden throne because his empire itself was his legacy. He did not need poets because every coin he saved was a monument more lasting than verse. His enemies called him a miser. History called him a genius. And perhaps there is a certain poetry in that the most frugal man of his age built the most enduring empire of it. The others left cathedrals and statues. Basil left solvency. He showed that strength, in its purest form, is not how loudly you can display your wealth, but how quietly you can keep it. It's an odd comfort, isn't it, to think that in an age of greed, one emperor found salvation in subtraction. He understood what so many rulers, and perhaps so many of us forget, that gold can be armor or poison, depending on how tightly you hold it. The stingiest hand, it turns out, sometimes builds the strongest wall. And when the fires of ambition have long burned out, what remains are not the jewels or the crowns, but the coins still resting, untouched. In the dark, the last quiet echo of a man who refused to waste what the world could never replace. After Basil II's vaults cooled and the echo of his coin-counting faded into legend, the question still lingered across the medieval world: what was wealth, really? Was it the glitter of gold in candlelight, or something quieter, something more enduring? For all the kings who hoarded and the merchants who traded, those who truly understood power knew that gold was only its reflection, not its essence. Coins could be stolen, lands could be conquered, but influence, that invisible currency of the Middle Ages, could survive the torch and the sword. We often imagine wealth as piles of treasure sealed in chests, guarded by dragons or accountants. But in reality, medieval fortune had little to do with glitter. The true measure of riches was control, the ability to make others labor, fight, or pray for your comfort. The peasants who tilled the soil didn't own the crops they grew. The knights who bled on battlefields didn't own the lands they fought for. And even many lords owed their estates to someone higher still. In that layered world, wealth was not what you held in your hands, it was what you commanded from others. Gold, in its physical form, was almost an inconvenience. Too heavy to move easily, too obvious to hide, too tempting to thieves. The truly powerful preferred subtler instruments, promises, oaths, and debts. A nobleman's word, sealed with a ring or a wax emblem, could unlock armies or bankrupt rivals. One sentence written on parchment might move more mountains than 10 carts of silver. In that sense, the medieval world was as modern as our own, a place where the illusion of value could be more potent than value itself. For most, land was the ultimate expression of control. A king's realm was nothing but the aggregation of all other men's obedience, pressed into acres and taxes. Each field represented not just food or money, but submission. A peasant could not simply pack up and leave. He was tied to the soil as surely as the roots of the wheat he harvested. The Lord owned the land, the king owned the Lord, and God owned the king, or so the church was happy to remind everyone. It was a perfect pyramid of possession, where even belief itself became a form of property. To the medieval mind, this arrangement felt natural. Wealth equaled order, and order equaled divine will. To be rich was not simply to be lucky, it was to be chosen. The idea of God's favor and material prosperity were bound together so tightly that questioning one meant questioning the other. Poverty was a test, but wealth was proof, a sign that heaven had smiled on you. That logic made the system nearly unbreakable. To rebel against it was to risk not just punishment on earth, but damnation beyond it. And yet, the power that came from wealth was rarely peaceful. The more you owned, the more you had to defend. A castle was both a fortress and a prison, a statement of authority built on fear. Inside its walls, the noble measured his importance by how many servants stood ready, how many candles burned at his table, how many banners carried his crest. But beyond the moat, the peasants watched that same fire and saw only hunger. For every feast, there were 100 empty stomachs. For every gold chalice, 100 blistered hands that had shaped it. Even the church, that self-proclaimed shepherd of souls, understood this hierarchy of wealth. Bishops and abbots controlled lands and peasants just as ruthlessly as barons did. Their cathedrals rose on the backs of laborers who might never be allowed to step inside them. And still, the faithful accepted it. After all, wasn't it comforting to believe that someone, somewhere, was storing up holiness on your behalf? The monks' chanting was a kind of investment, a spiritual portfolio that promised eternal dividends. It is easy to laugh at such logic now, but perhaps it wasn't so different from ours. The medieval world had its own stock market, though it dealt not in companies but in relationships, loyalty, patronage, favor. A man could rise not by invention but by proximity. Serve a powerful lord well enough, and you might receive land or title in return. Fail him, and you might lose everything, sometimes including your head. Wealth was personal, not transactional. There were no contracts, only trust, or the kind of fear that made trust unnecessary. A noble who understood this could amass immense influence without ever touching gold. He would arrange marriages that tied families together, forge alliances that placed his name beside kings, and sponsor churches that prayed for his soul long after his bones had turned to dust. In a world where few could read, reputation was a more stable currency than any coin. Your worth was whispered in halls, written in chronicles, and remembered at feasts. The rich did not simply own, they were remembered for owning. Meanwhile, the peasants who fueled all this grandeur learned the hard way that obedience was its own form of taxation. Every hour of labor, every tithe to the church, every military levy was a payment extracted from their lives. Their reward was not wealth, but stability, the fragile peace that came from knowing tomorrow would be exactly like today. To question the system was dangerous, to dream beyond it, foolish. And yet, they endured. The plowman's endurance was the foundation of every throne, and the laughter of a peasant child, rare as it was, might have been the truest wealth in that world. Still, even among the highborn, wealth was never absolute. It was fragile, ephemeral, and endlessly contested. One plague could wipe out half your tenants. One storm could destroy your harvest. One royal whim could confiscate your estate. Every noble knew that his fortune rested on the shifting ground of favor, divine, royal, or both. That was why they built cathedrals, why they donated gold to monasteries, why they prayed with eyes half open. You never knew which kind of loyalty to God or to the king would save you first. And then, as cities began to rise, a new kind of wealth emerged, one that didn't care for lineage or divine right. The merchants of Venice, Bruges, and Genoa discovered that power could travel in ships. A man with no noble blood could command more gold than a duke. Trade became the great equalizer, and with it came a subtle revolution. The feudal pyramid trembled. The merchants didn't own people, they owned goods. But goods could move, and movement was freedom. Yet even they were haunted by the same truth. Money was never enough. To stay rich, you needed influence, someone to guard your ships, to grant your licenses, to forgive your debts when fortune turned. And so the merchant became what every medieval man eventually became: a petitioner, forever kneeling before someone richer. Perhaps that is the essence of medieval wealth. A circle of dependence dressed as hierarchy. The king relied on the nobles on their tenants, the peasants on their god. No one was truly independent, not even the emperor. Every fortune, no matter how vast, was built on borrowed faith, the belief that others would keep obeying, keep believing, keep paying. In that sense, gold was merely the shadow cast by power. Real wealth was human, the capacity to command, to inspire, or to frighten. A lord's coins could buy food, but his authority could buy silence. And silence was priceless. Looking back, it is almost poetic how an age so obsessed with material glory never truly trusted the material itself. Coins rusted, lands changed hands, dynasties rose and fell. But obedience, that stayed. The system worked not because of the weight of gold, but because everyone agreed to its illusion. The church told the peasants that obedience was holy. The nobles told the church that obedience was profitable. And the peasants, weary and devout, nodded. So what was wealth, really, in the Middle Ages? It was not the treasure hoarded in castle vaults or the spices piled high in merchant ships. It was the quiet nod of submission, the bowed head, the promise of service. It was the understanding that one man's comfort was built from another's exhaustion. And yet, beneath that hard truth, there lingered something oddly human, the desire for recognition. Even the richest man of the age, sitting in his candlelit hall, surrounded by gold and tapestries, still wanted to be seen, respected, remembered. Perhaps that is the final paradox of medieval wealth, that no matter how much you owned, it only meant something when someone else cared that you did. Gold glittered, but power glowed. And the glow, however dim or cruel, was the one thing the Middle Ages never learned to live without. If the king was the sun, the nobles were his orbiting moons bright enough to reflect his power, but forever trapped in his gravity. Dukes, earls, counts, and barons made up the glittering middle tier of the medieval pyramid. Those who neither ruled absolutely nor obeyed entirely. They lived in castles, commanded armies, and measured their worth not in coins, but in acres. To be noble was not merely to be rich. It was to own the earth itself, the fields, the forests, the rivers, and the people who toiled upon them. Land was the bloodstream of power, and nobility was the art of keeping it flowing without losing one's head. A noble's fortune was as wide as his lands, but as fragile as his reputation. In an age without banks or stock markets, every stream and pasture was an investment, every peasant a renewable resource. The lord did not farm, of course, that was the peasant's role. His job was to rule, to feast, to wage war when summoned, and above all, to stay in favor. For in the medieval world, wealth flowed not just from the soil, but from proximity to the throne. One royal smile could make a man rich for generations. One royal frown could erase his entire lineage overnight. The arrangement seemed simple enough on parchment. The king granted land to his vassals in exchange for loyalty and military service. But the reality was a dance of suspicion and diplomacy. Each noble was both servant and rival to the crown, too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to trust. It was said in whispers that the king gave you land and could take your head, and every nobleman understood that truth intimately. A fortune in land was also a leash. Imagine the world of a baron in the 13th century. Dawn breaks over his estate, mist curling around his manor's gray stone towers. Beneath him stretch fields heavy with dew, dotted with peasants beginning their day-long labor. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. The baron's steward arrives, ledger in hand, to report how many bushels of grain will be collected, how many tenants owe rent, how many pigs have gone missing. Every statistic is a note in the symphony of his wealth, the quiet, endless accounting that keeps the noble world spinning. By mid-morning, the baron is not in the fields but in the hall, seated before a long oak table polished by centuries of elbows. Breakfast, if one could call it that, is a feast by modern standards. Bread white as bone, cured meats, honey, and imported wine. He eats surrounded by family, priests, and guests, whose flattery is as constant as the smoke from the hearth. Every conversation, no matter how casual, has political weight. To praise the weather might be to hint at trade prospects. To complain of taxes might be to test loyalty. The nobleman's greatest skill is not strength or courage, but interpretation, reading what is meant between words, what is owed between gestures. For all their grandeur, the nobles were perpetually anxious creatures. Their wealth was visible, and visibility was peril. To appear too rich was to invite envy from both the church and the crown. To appear too poor was to invite contempt. Survival required balance, a life performed as much as lived. Feasts were both necessity and performance, where tables groaned under roasted swans and candied fruits, and minstrels sang of glory while servants refilled goblets of wine worth a peasant's yearly wage. Guests left impressed. The baron left calculating how many more pigs he could tax to afford the next banquet. The more powerful nobles maintained entire households that mirrored miniature kingdoms: knights for defense, scribes for records, stewards for accounting, and chaplains to remind them that even luxury required divine permission. Falconry, hunting, and tournaments were not mere pastimes. They were investments in status. A falcon imported from the East could cost as much as a small village, but to own one signaled refinement and reach. A jousting tournament was a public declaration of wealth, strength, and if one survived, favor from God. But beneath the gold and silk lay a chronic tension. Nobles were rich because others were poor. Their estates flourished on the backs of peasants who lived one bad harvest away from starvation. The Lord's feasts were lit by the candles bought with the same tithes that darkened the cottages below. And yet, this system persisted for centuries, sustained by faith and fear. The peasants believed their suffering kept the world in order. The nobles believed their privilege was duty. Both were wrong and both were right in the strange arithmetic of feudalism. The church, ever the watchful referee, reminded the nobles that generosity bought salvation, conveniently accepting their donations in the form of land, gold, and promises. A noble's guilt became the church's income, his sins converted into stone cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts. The result was a moral economy as intricate as the political one. Sin, spend, repent, repeat. Royal jealousy was the shadow that haunted every castle. Kings tolerated wealthy vassals as long as their loyalty remained unquestioned. But a nobleman with too many troops, too many allies, or too much charisma became a threat. History is littered with examples barons executed under false charges, their lands reclaimed for the crown. Wealthy nobles built castles not only as symbols of power, but as shields against royal paranoia. Some even married their daughters strategically, binding their bloodlines to the throne in the hope of safety. But blood ties, like treaties, could dissolve faster than wine spilled on parchment. Consider the case of William Marshall, the legendary knight who rose from a landless younger son to the wealthiest noble in England. His loyalty, skill, and restraint earned him lands from Henry II and respect across Europe. Yet even he walked a tightrope of trust. Each new monarch tested his allegiance anew. He survived not because he was invincible, but because he was indispensable, a lesson every noble prayed to learn before it was too late. At the other extreme were nobles whose vanity exceeded their sense. They built halls too grand, threw feasts too frequent, and forgot that kings dislike equals. The greater the display, the shorter the life. In the medieval hierarchy, modesty was camouflage. The wise baron dressed richly only in private, gave publicly to the church, and smiled humbly when praised by his betters. The game was eternal, and the price of losing was not exile, but execution. And yet, for all the danger, the life of a noble was enviable to nearly everyone below. They had meat daily, clean clothing, and time to dream. They commissioned poets to immortalize them, sculptors to carve their likeness in marble, and troubadours to turn their lives into legend. To a peasant, the noble's world seemed divine, a realm of eternal banquets and fragrant gardens. They could not see the sleepless nights, the political anxieties, the quiet terror of receiving a royal summons that might end in a banquet or a beheading. In truth, the nobles were trapped too in velvet chains rather than iron ones. They were prisoners of their privilege, forced to maintain appearances at any cost. Every gesture, every alliance, every word spoken at court carried risk. Their children were bargaining chips, their marriages contracts, their homes showcases. They lived in luxury, yes, but rarely in peace. Over time, the same wealth that gave them power also sowed their downfall. The rise of trade in cities eroded their monopoly on riches. Merchants began to rival them in influence, and kings found new ways to tax commerce instead of crops. By the end of the Middle Ages, the nobles' authority was more memory than reality, a portrait fading in candlelight. Still, in the centuries they ruled, they defined what it meant to be rich in the medieval sense, not the possession of gold, but the possession of others' labor and loyalty. Their names filled chronicles, their castles dotted the hills like monuments to human hierarchy. They feasted as the world turned beneath them, convinced that God himself had arranged the menu. And perhaps, in a way, he had, or at least the version of him they paid the priest to describe. In the end, the noble's wealth was both triumph and trap. He owned the land, but the land owned him. His name would outlive his body, carved into stone and sealed with wax, while his descendants inherited not freedom, but the endless burden of staying rich. In that way, the medieval noble was the perfect symbol of his age. If the nobles were the landlords of luxury, then the knights were its enforcers, the steel beneath the silk. They were the glittering teeth of the feudal order, armored in faith, debt, and ambition. In poetry, they were painted as chivalric heroes. In practice, they were professional gamblers whose table was the battlefield and whose currency was blood. Each dawn before battle, a knight strapped on not just his armor but his financial hopes, because every campaign offered two possible outcomes: wealth beyond imagination, or death in a muddy ditch. To become a knight in the Middle Ages was to sign an invisible contract, one written not in ink, but in obligation. Training began in childhood. At 7, a boy of noble birth was sent away from his family to serve as a page in another lord's castle. There, he learned the art of manners before the art of murder: how to pour wine without spilling, how to hold a lady's glove, how to bow, how to pray. It was only later, as a squire, that he learned to swing a sword, polish armor, and tend to the horse that would one day carry both his fortunes and his fears into battle. For every knight on the field, there were at least a dozen servants keeping him alive: blacksmiths, grooms, squires, armorers, cooks. The armor itself was worth a small fortune, sometimes more than the knight's yearly income. It was a full-body investment, forged from the taxes of peasants who would never see battle, designed to protect a man who would spend much of his career trying not to die. But that armor also made him valuable. A knight was a walking treasury, expensive to equip, expensive to maintain, and, in the right circumstances, expensive to capture. Because here lies the strange truth about medieval warfare. For all its blood and brutality, it was also a business. The goal wasn't always to kill, but to profit. Capturing an enemy knight, especially one of noble birth, could yield a ransom equivalent to a lifetime's wealth. Some soldiers became specialists in this grim trade, striking not for the heart but for the purse. It was common for a knight to shout his name and title before charging into combat, not from vanity, but from survival. "I am Sir Richard of Gloucester," was not a boast but a financial statement, a plea for recognition. "If you knock me from my horse, remember who I am. I am worth more alive than dead." And so the battlefield became a peculiar market of fortunes. Men risked everything in the hope that one well-timed blow might deliver them riches enough to buy a manor, a title, or freedom from service. The ransom economy created an unspoken etiquette of slaughter. Certain men were too valuable to kill. A peasant foot soldier might be crushed without a thought, but a noble knight? No, he was prophet. War, for all its chaos, had rules that money understood perfectly. Of course, the dream of fortune came with its own grim footnote. If you survived, armor was heavy, heat unbearable, and wounds often fatal not from steel, but from infection. The smell of a battlefield was not glory, but rot blood, sweat, horse dung, and the iron scent of fear. Yet knights accepted this as the cost of the gamble. The higher the risk, the higher the reward. The life of a knight off the battlefield was no less precarious. Between wars, many were little better than mercenaries. Some hired themselves to wealthy nobles or kings, others to foreign lords who paid better. The code of chivalry might forbid fighting for gold, but reality was less romantic. A knight needed coin to maintain his armor, horses, and household, and coin, like honor, could not be eaten. Many served in private wars, guarding caravans, escorting pilgrims, or enforcing debts. Their swords were for hire, their loyalty negotiable. But not all gambles were fought in open fields. Tournaments, those great spectacles of violence and vanity, became the medieval equivalent of the stock market. A skilled knight could earn both fame and fortune by unseating opponents in jousts, earning prizes, sponsorships, and invitations to the royal court. The audience saw chivalry, the competitors saw opportunity. Behind the pageantry, debts were paid, alliances forged, and reputations bought or sold. The church, predictably, tried to sanctify the chaos. It preached that knights were God's soldiers, protectors of the innocent and defenders of the faith. Crusades turned this moral rhetoric into global enterprise. When the Pope called for holy war, thousands of knights saw not just salvation, but spoils: gold, land, relics, and redemption, all waiting beyond the sea. A ticket to heaven, financed by conquest. Yet beneath the hymns and banners, the same truth endured. Every knight was still a businessman of blood. The crusader who took Jerusalem often returned not purified, but rich, his armor dented, his conscience less so. Some became lords in the conquered lands, building their fortunes on the bones of others. Others died nameless in the desert, their armor stripped, their bodies left to bleach beneath the sunday. Even in Europe, loyalty was fragile. Knights were bound to their lords by oaths, but oaths could be bent by gold. A discontented vassal could turn mercenary overnight, taking up arms for whoever offered better pay or pardon. The great wars of medieval Europe, from the 100 Years' War to endless regional feuds, were sustained by these professional warriors, men who believed in duty only as long as it was profitable. Their honor, though loudly proclaimed, was as negotiable as their wages. Still, the image of the knight persisted: shining armor, noble cause, gallant heart. It was propaganda, of course, but effective. Poets sang of valor, ladies embroidered coats of arms, and young boys dreamed of tournaments instead of fields. Society needed its heroes, even if they were bought. The knight became both symbol and scapegoat, admired for his courage, blamed for his greed, but never ignored. The economic system around him depended on that contradiction. Lords needed knights to enforce their rule. Kings needed them to wage wars, and the church needed them to sanctify violence. The knight's existence justified everyone else's wealth, a reminder that privilege was protected not by prayer or parchment, but by men in armor willing to kill for it. Yet for all their steel and ceremony, most knights were haunted by insecurity. Their fortunes rose and fell with the tides of war. A single lost battle could ruin them. A single favor from a lord could restore them. They were both indispensable and expendable tools of empire, wearing the illusion of glory. Many ended their lives not in heroism, but in debt. Armor had to be pawned, horses sold, lands mortgaged. Families of fallen knights often begged the church for charity, their lineage reduced to a cautionary tale. And so, the knight's life was an endless negotiation with fate, a ledger of blood and coin. His sword could elevate him to nobility, or drag him to ruin. His armor could protect him from arrows, but not from politics. His prayers might save his soul, but never his estate. Even the most celebrated warriors, like Bertrand du Guesclin or the Black Prince, lived on the edge of both triumph and exhaustion, their victories written in the same ink as their debts. In quieter moments, between wars, a knight might look at the scarred hands that had earned him his title and wonder what it had all been for. Was the glint of gold worth the smell of death? Was honor anything more than another kind of currency traded, displayed, and eventually spent? The troubadours would answer yes, of course, for they lived off such myths. But the knight, cleaning his blade by firelight, might have known better. He understood what the poets refused to say, that the battlefield was not a place of destiny, but of arithmetic. You wagered your life for a chance at another man's ransom, and if fortune smiled, you lived to wager again. And if not, then death was simply the fine print of the contract, the clause. No one read aloud when they swore the oaths of knighthood. So when you picture those shining figures of legend, remember that behind every visor was not a saint, but a gambler praying to win the only game that mattered. If the knights were busy bleeding for fortune, there was another path to wealth in the Middle Ages, one that required neither sword nor saddle, but silence, patience, and the right kind of Latin. While the men of iron gambled with their lives, the men of God built an empire far greater than any battlefield could win. The church was not merely a religion. It was the medieval world's most successful corporation, multinational before the word existed, tax-exempt before anyone dared to question it, and eternal in both ambition and branding. Where others conquered land, the church conquered belief, and through belief, it conquered everything else. By the 12th century, monasteries and abbeys had become the beating economic heart of Europe. Their bells ruled time itself, not kings, not markets. Dawn was when the monk said matins, noon was when they broke fast, and sunset was when the Angelus tolled. The rhythm of prayer disguised the rhythm of profit. Each humble monastery operated like a self-contained estate, complete with farms, workshops, vineyards, fisheries, and mills. Monks brewed ale, pressed grapes, tanned hides, copied manuscripts, and collected rents from tenants who were told that their labor glorified God. In truth, it kept the cloisters comfortable and the abbots prosperous. Poverty, in the medieval church, was not so much a condition as a costume. The monks swore to renounce personal wealth, but not institutional wealth, a clever distinction that turned humility into an accounting trick. An abbot could live in a stone palace surrounded by orchards and servants, all while technically remaining poor because the riches belonged to the monastery, not to him. Gold chalices glittered beneath frescoed ceilings as psalms echoed in the air, each one thanking God for blessings that seemed to fall disproportionately on those closest to the altar. To join the church was, for many, the only legitimate way for a commoner to rise. While noble sons inherited land and knights fought for ransom, clever peasants could find salvation and salary behind monastery walls. Education was the church's monopoly, and literacy was the key to influence. A peasant's son who could read scripture might one day oversee lands, advise nobles, even crown kings. The monastery was both seminary and sanctuary, a ladder built of prayers and parchment. The wealth of these religious houses was staggering. Take Glastonbury Abbey in England. By the 14th century, its yearly income rivaled that of small kingdoms. Westminster, Cluny, and Monte Cassino functioned as both spiritual centers and economic engines, owning thousands of acres and employing entire villages. Pilgrims came seeking grace. The monks sold them relics, indulgences, and hospitality, all at a markup, naturally. In a sense, faith became the Middle Ages' most lucrative export, traded in every language, taxed in every currency, and guaranteed by eternity. The church justified this fortune with a kind of divine logic. The poor shall inherit the earth, they preached, while ensuring that heaven remained the only inheritance the poor would ever see. The faithful were told that their tithes bought salvation, a modest 10% of their harvest, paid in coin or grain. The church called it charity. The peasants called it Tuesday. Every week, wagons laden with offerings rolled into monasteries, where they were counted by tonsured accountants who hummed hymns between sums. What made the church's wealth so unassailable was its invisibility. Kings and nobles flaunted gold, but the church's treasure was buried in documents, land grants, endowments, wills. Each generation of the dying wealthy ensured their souls a smooth passage by donating a slice of their estate to God. The church never died, and so the land never returned. Century by century, its holdings expanded until it became the single largest landowner in Europe. If the king ruled by sword, the church ruled by parchment. And unlike kings, priests didn't need armies to defend their borders. They had fear. Eternal, metaphysical fear, the most efficient weapon of all. To question the church's wealth was to question God's will, and few dared. Heresy wasn't just rebellion, it was treason against heaven. Those who asked why the poor monks dined on venison or why bishops owned castles often found themselves excommunicated, cut off from salvation like a debtor from credit. Meanwhile, within the cloisters, life appeared peaceful, almost holy. At dawn, the monks filed into the chapel, their chants rising through the cold stone, breath misting in the chill. At noon, they ate in silence as scripture was read aloud. At dusk, they prayed again, their day bookended by ritual. Yet between those prayers lay hours of labor, and labor meant profit. The monks who brewed ale did so with a precision that would impress modern brewers. The brothers who copied manuscripts sometimes slipped in their own names as signatures of pride. Each abbey became a factory of virtue, pious on the surface, industrious underneath. Not all clergy lived cloistered lives. The bishops and cardinals, those who climbed higher in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, lived like princes. They wore rings heavy with jewels, rode in carriages, and hosted banquets that rivaled royal courts. One of the most notorious was Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, the son of an Ipswich butcher who rose to become Henry VIII's most powerful advisor. His official vow of poverty did little to prevent him from spending the modern equivalent of £25 million renovating Hampton Court Palace, a gift to himself disguised as a tribute to the king. The church, of course, had an answer for this. Wealth, they argued, was not evil if used to glorify God. Cathedrals were not indulgences, but acts of devotion. Gold chalices reflected divine light. Marble altars honored the saints. The grandeur of the church was, in their words, a glimpse of heaven on earth. And to the illiterate masses, it worked. Standing beneath a cathedral's vaulted ceiling, surrounded by stained glass glowing like the very firmament, who could doubt that God favored the men who built it? In many ways, the church's wealth served as a mirror for the society it ruled. Just as kings demanded taxes to maintain order, the clergy demanded tithes to maintain salvation. Both promised protection, one of the body, one of the soul. The difference was that the church's protection extended beyond death, and eternity is a difficult market to compete with. Yet not every monk was a hypocrite, nor every priest corrupt. Many genuinely believed that their prosperity was part of God's plan, that their abundance allowed them to care for the needy. Monasteries often distributed bread to the poor, tended the sick, and offered shelter to travelers. But even charity had its hierarchy. The bread given to beggars came from grain harvested by peasants who had already paid their tithe. The poor fed the poorer, and the church collected gratitude like interest. From an economic standpoint, it was genius. From a moral one, it was murkier. Still, the system endured because it worked. The faithful prayed, the clergy prospered, and everyone believed the arrangement was eternal. For centuries, the church was Europe's banker, landlord, and record-keeper rolled into one. Kings might die on battlefields, merchants might sink with their ships, but abbeys lasted. They were repositories not just of wealth, but of time itself. In their libraries, the memory of the ancient world was preserved, and in their ledgers, the future of Europe was quietly written. Perhaps that was the church's greatest strength, its patience. While knights measured success in victories and nobles in generations, the church measured in centuries. Its wealth was cumulative, its influence slow and steady. Empires crumbled around it, but the monasteries remained, their bells still tolling through the fog of time. And so, if you lived in the Middle Ages and wanted to be rich without risking your head, you didn't pick up a sword, you picked up a psalter. You learned to chant, to count, to copy. You prayed not only for your soul, but for your survival. And if you were lucky or cunning, you might one day look down from a cloister window at the peasants bent in the fields below and whisper, with quiet satisfaction, that the Lord truly works in mysterious and remarkably profitable ways. If monasteries were the banks of the medieval world, then priests and cardinals were its brokers, men who learned early that salvation and finance often spoke the same language. To rise within the church was to climb the most lucrative ladder in Christendom, a staircase built not of marble but of obedience, literacy, and an impeccable sense of timing. For while knights gambled with blood and merchants gambled with ships, the clever cleric gambled with souls and often won. The beauty of the priesthood was that it promised equality before God while quietly rewarding hierarchy among men. A poor boy could not become a baron, but he could become a bishop. The church, after all, needed talent as much as it needed faith. Every monastery, cathedral, and court required not only prayers but paperwork tithes to collect, lands to manage, letters to write in the Latin that peasants could not read. To be educated was to be indispensable, and the church held the monopoly on education. From that quiet monopoly rose some of the richest, most powerful men the Middle Ages ever produced. Enter Thomas Wolsey, a name whispered in envy and fear across Tudor England. He began life not in velvet but in the smell of raw meat, born to a butcher in Ipswich. In another century, his fate would have been to die in debt or in obscurity. But Wolsey had something rarer than noble blood: intellect sharpened by ambition. Sent to Oxford, he graduated in his teens, and by his 20s, his sermons had caught the ears of those who mattered. The church, ever pragmatic, saw in him what it always prized most: a man who could turn faith into influence. By middle age, Wolsey was no longer the son of a butcher, but the architect of kings. As Cardinal, Archbishop of York, and Lord Chancellor of England, he amassed wealth so vast it blurred the line between piety and monarchy. His residences included Hampton Court Palace, a sprawling estate so grand that King Henry VIII himself would later claim it as his own. Wolsey did not live like a saint. He lived like an emperor draped in scarlet robes. His servants numbered in the hundreds. His banquets rivaled royal feasts, and his silverware gleamed with the reflection of power itself. And yet, Wolsey never broke a single vow. Officially, he owned nothing. The riches, he argued, belonged to the church. That was the brilliance of clerical wealth. It was collective, not personal, and therefore beyond reproach. Gold, jewels, tapestries, and manors flowed through the hands of the faithful like divine rainfall, nourishing those who stood beneath the church's umbrella. "Poverty," said the monks, "is our calling." The fine print, of course, read, "provided it's someone else's." Wolsey was far from alone. Across Europe, the clergy had long perfected the art of turning sanctity into solvency. Monasteries lent money to kings under the polite euphemism of advances against future tithes. Since usury charging interest was technically forbidden by Scripture, creative accounting stepped in. A gift might be given to secure a favor, which could later be thanked with another gift. The transaction danced around sin, never quite touching it, at least not in writing. It was a system both brilliant and blasphemous, and it worked astonishingly well. By the 13th century, major monasteries and abbeys functioned as proto-banks. They safeguarded treasures, issued letters of credit, and financed crusades that turned profit as much as piety. Kings who waged holy war did so with borrowed holiness, their campaigns funded by the very institutions that preached humility. And when monarchs defaulted on their donations, the church simply collected land instead of coin. Thus faith became the world's most secure collateral. To the common folk, it was all wrapped in the aura of divine order. The priest who rode through town on a fine horse, his robe trimmed with fur, was not flaunting wealth, they were told, but representing the majesty of heaven. The jeweled chalice on the altar, a vessel worthy of Christ's blood. The towering cathedral spire, a symbol of humanity's yearning for God. But to those inside the system, these symbols were also investments. visible proof that faith paid dividends. Wolsey himself understood this better than anyone. His relationship with King Henry VIII was both political and personal, a dance of deference and domination. He managed England's finances, brokered treaties, and shaped foreign policy, all while presiding over church courts that could imprison men for heresy. For a time, he was England's second son, his power rivaling the crown's. Nobles bowed, bishops obeyed, and merchants paid. But power that shines too brightly always risks burning. When Wolsey failed to secure the Pope's annulment for Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his fortunes collapsed overnight. His enemies, many of them men he had once appointed, moved swiftly. The same king who had called him faithful servant now called him traitor. His estates were seized, his palaces confiscated, his robes stripped. He died on his way to London to face trial, murmuring, "Had I but served my God as diligently as I have my king, he would not have given me over to my enemies in my gray hairs." It was the closest thing to a confession money ever made. Still, Wolsey's story was not an anomaly but a pattern. From the medieval popes who waged wars to the abbots who lived as lords, the church's hierarchy was filled with men who blurred the boundary between holiness and politics. The papal states of Italy alone were a kingdom in all but name, complete with armies, taxes, and treaties. The Pope was both Christ's vicar and Europe's most calculating diplomat. When excommunication became too common to frighten anyone, he turned instead to economics, indulgences, tithes, and taxes on sin. Heaven, it seemed, was open to all, provided you could afford the entrance fee. The irony was so thick it could be gilded. The church, born in poverty, grew fat on repentance. Preachers thundered about humility while reclining on silk cushions. Sermons against greed were delivered from pulpits carved in gold leaf. But hypocrisy was not the bug of the system, it was the fuel. The faithful gave more generously when they believed the act itself purchased purity, and the clergy, in turn, reinvested that generosity into cathedrals, relics, and influence. In their defense, some clerics genuinely saw wealth as a means to a higher purpose. Cathedrals employed thousands of workers. Their construction stimulated local economies. Manuscripts commissioned by bishops preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Art, architecture, and even music thrived under the church's lavish patronage. Beauty was, in their minds, another form of prayer. If the world was to glimpse heaven, it needed marble and stained glass to frame the view. And yet, beneath the incense and choir song, the ledgers never stopped humming. The church was the original franchise. Each parish a branch, each tithe a transaction, each confession a reminder of customer loyalty. Salvation had become a subscription model. To live as a wealthy cleric was to walk a tightrope between reverence and resentment. On one side stood kings and nobles who envied the church's untaxed power. On the other, peasants who saw their last loaf of bread carried away as offering. It was an elegant balancing act, sustained by ceremony and fear. But even the most gilded cathedrals cast long shadows. Those shadows would one day lengthen into Reformation. But in the high Middle Ages, as bells rang across the continent, the partnership between holiness and hypocrisy seemed eternal. From Canterbury to Cologne, from Rome to Rheims, priests blessed the world with one hand and signed contracts with the other. It was the golden age of the cloth, the century when the pulpit became a throne, and the man who spoke of heaven often lived as if he already owned it. And perhaps, in his own way, Thomas Wolsey did. For even stripped of titles and treasures, his rise proved the oldest secret of medieval wealth. You didn't need to fight wars or inherit crowns. You simply had to master the holiest business of all, convincing others that your fortune was God's will. If the kings ruled by sword and the church ruled by scripture, then the peasants ruled by necessity, though no one would ever have dared to say it aloud. They were the voiceless foundation of the medieval world, the invisible machinery that kept every field green and every kingdom fed. And like most machinery, they were expected to run endlessly, noiselessly, and without complaint. Their strength built cathedrals, Their sweat financed crusades. Their obedience sustained empires, and yet, history rarely remembered their names. Picture a village in the 14th century. A thin wisp of smoke rises from thatched roofs. Chickens wander across the mud, and a bent figure moves slowly behind an ox-drawn plow. That man's life began and will end in the same field. He was born on that soil, baptized by the village priest, and bound to the same Lord who owns the land beneath his feet. The very word serf comes from the Latin servus, servant, slave, one who serves. His labor is not his own. His harvest is not his own. Even his children, by law and custom, belong more to his master than to him. This was the economic miracle of feudalism, an entire society built on loyalty and labor, where the loyalty flowed upward and the labor flowed downward. For the peasant, wealth was measured not in coins but in survival. A good year meant the harvest was enough to eat through winter. A bad year meant hunger, debt, or death. The peasants paid rent in grain, taxes in work, and gratitude in silence. They plowed the fields of the noble, built the monasteries of the church, and then tithed a tenth of what remained to ensure their soul's safety in the next life. It was, by any measure, a perfect system for everyone except those doing the work. The rhythms of a peasant's life were as predictable as the seasons. Dawn meant labor. Dusk meant more labor. A man might rise before sunrise, his body already aching from yesterday, to mend fences or sow barley. Women worked beside men, weeding, washing, carrying, cooking, birthing, their labor as constant and uncelebrated as breathing. Children joined the workforce as soon as they could walk, herding geese, fetching water, or collecting firewood. Old age, if it came, was simply the slow fading of strength until the field claimed them again. There was no illusion of mobility. A serf could not simply leave. His lord's permission was required to marry, to move, even to die somewhere else. His body was, legally, part of the estate, as much property as the oxen or the millstone. Free men did exist, of course, but freedom was often theoretical. They still paid rent, taxes, and tithes, and owed military service in times of war. Their freedom was a paper distinction in a world where paper itself was rare. And yet, the peasantry was not entirely without leverage. Lords could not eat parchment, nor could priests pray grain into existence. Without peasants, there was no bread, no taxes, no civilization at all. The lords might command, but they depended utterly on those they despised. That dependency created a quiet, dangerous truth. The knowledge that if the plow stopped, the world would too. Most peasants never tested that truth, but a few did. Occasionally, famine, plague, or sheer desperation tipped the balance. In 1381, England's peasants' revolt erupted like a crack in the feudal order. Armed with scythes and farm tools, thousands of laborers marched toward London, demanding the impossible: fair wages, freedom from serfdom, and justice under God. They burned manorial records, those fragile scrolls that declared their servitude, and executed tax collectors. For a brief, blazing moment, the powerless backbone straightened. The rebellion failed, of course. Revolts usually do. But its echo lingered in every frightened noble heart, the realization that the same hands that fed the kingdom could also starve it. Most peasants, however, did not rebel. They endured. They found humor in hardship, songs in suffering, community in exhaustion. On feast days, they drank ale, danced in the mud, and told stories by the fire, small rebellions of joy against a system that demanded their submission. Their saints were not the jeweled figures of the church, but the simple protectors of plowmen and shepherds, those who knew what it meant to work until one's back curved like a bow. Still, some dreamed of escape. The city's noisy, filthy, alive, whispered promises of freedom. Stadtluft macht frei, went the Germans saying. City air makes you free. It was true, to a point. A peasant who managed to live in a town for a year and a day without being caught could legally claim freedom from his lord. But the journey was perilous. Lords hunted runaway serfs as they would thieves. Those who were caught were flogged or branded, sometimes mutilated as a warning to others. Those who succeeded often found that urban freedom came with its own chains, poverty, disease, and hunger of a different kind. In towns like Bruges or Florence, escaped peasants became laborers, masons, or apprentices. A lucky few might join guilds, earn coin, and carve out a fragile independence. But most found themselves living in cramped alleys, their lives traded for wages scarcely better than their former bondage. The city did not promise comfort. It promised anonymity. And sometimes that was enough. For those who stayed on the land, life was ruled by forces beyond understanding weather, disease, and the will of God. When the crops failed, the priest urged patience. When the plague came, he urged repentance. The peasants accepted both, because they had no choice. Theirs was a theology of endurance. Heaven was not an abstract reward. It was the only justice left. And yet, through all this hardship, the peasants' labor quietly sustained every miracle of the Middle Ages. Every knight's armor, every loaf baked for a monastery feast, every stone raised for a cathedral was paid for in peasant sweat. The grandeur of kings stood on their shoulders, though no chronicler ever said so. The illuminated manuscripts praised saints and lords, but never the farmer who fed the monk who copied the text. Their absence from history was not an accident. It was the silence required to keep history's gears turning. The irony was that their suffering created the very stability that allowed art, science, and commerce to grow. Because the peasants toiled, others could pray, fight, or trade. Civilization's beauty was built on their exhaustion. Their anonymity was both a curse and a gift. They kept the world running precisely because they were too numerous, too replaceable, to stop it. Occasionally, the church attempted to elevate their labor with spiritual language. Work, the priest preached, was sacred. To till the earth was to share in God's creation. To obey one's Lord was to honor the divine order. It was a comforting sermon and a convenient one. For while heaven was open to all, its earthly administrators made sure the road to it passed through tithes and toil. Even in death, the peasant's place was humble. Their graves lay outside the churchyard walls, marked by wooden crosses that rotted within a season. The noble dead lay under stone, their effigies carved in eternal prayer. The peasant dead returned to the soil they had never truly left, dust to dust, rent to rent. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about the medieval peasant was not his misery, but his endurance. Despite famine, plague, and oppression, Europe's fields never truly emptied. Villages rebuilt after fires, crops grew again after locusts, and children sang while reaping barley under the same sun that had seen their ancestors do the same. It was a grim kind of immortality, a legacy written not in monuments but in motion, the steady turning of wheels, mills, and seasons. If wealth in the Middle Ages was measured by control, then no one was poorer than the peasant. And yet, paradoxically, no one was more essential. He owned nothing, but produced everything. His prayers filled the churches, his taxes filled the coffers, his sweat filled the granaries. The nobility called him churl, the clergy called him flock, the merchants called him customer. But the truth was simpler. He was the spine of a civilization that pretended not to notice its own bones. So when we speak of kings and popes and merchants getting rich, we should pause to remember who made their fortunes possible. The peasant, bent over his field, was not merely surviving, he was carrying history on his back. He was the world's quiet architect, building empires one furrow at a time. He never sought glory, and he never received it. But if you close your eyes and listen beyond the clanging of armor, beyond the hymns of cathedrals, you might still hear the low, rhythmic sound of the plow cutting through the earth. It is the heartbeat of the Middle Ages, steady, unending, anonymous, and without it, every golden throne, every jeweled chalice, every sermon, and every empire would have fallen into silence long ago. By the time the peasants were bowing to lords and monks were counting their tithes, a new sound began to rise from the heart of Europe, the creak of ships, the clatter of carts, the murmur of bargaining voices that spoke not of salvation or fealty, but of profit. The Middle Ages had long been a world of soil and sword, but in the narrow, salt-scented streets of cities like Venice, Bruges, and Florence, something quietly revolutionary was being born. It was not a crusade, nor a heresy, nor a kingdom. It was an idea that risk itself could be turned into wealth. If the countryside belonged to the nobility, the city belonged to those brave enough to gamble against fate. Venice floated on trade like a jewel on water, its ships cutting across the Adriatic like silver blades. Bruges, cold and northern, buzzed with Flemish weavers and bankers who turned wool into gold. Florence glittered with Florence coins, so trusted they were accepted across Europe, stamped with the proud fleur-de-lis of a city that worshipped both God and commerce in equal measure. These cities were the laboratories of capitalism long before the word existed. Their citizens were not born to privilege. They earned it with cunning, courage, and ledgers. While knights died for honor and peasants died for bread, merchants risked both for spice. They financed expeditions, insured ships, and bought cargoes from lands whose names they could barely pronounce. A single voyage from the east might last years, cost a fortune, and end at the bottom of the sea or in unimaginable profit. Every sail that vanished over the horizon carried both ruin and redemption in its wake. In this new world, bloodlines mattered less than boldness. A peasant could not become a prince, but a trader could become a man whom princes owed money to, and that was often better. Gold had a way of silencing titles. Soon, the merchant guilds of Venice and Florence rivaled noble houses in influence. They built palaces not as fortresses, but as statements, facades of marble and fresco to declare that power could be purchased, not inherited. Venice was perhaps the most daring of all. Its wealth did not come from land, for it had none, but from the sea. The Venetians built ships faster than other cities built cathedrals. Their arsenal, a shipyard so vast it could launch a fully equipped galley every day, was the beating heart of their empire. They traded glass, salt, silk, and slaves with equal efficiency. Their morality as fluid as their tides. Every voyage was a wager, on the weather, on pirates, on politics. Yet somehow, Venice always won. They turned risk into an art form, and profit into a religion. Further north, Bruges rose from the marshes to become the warehouse of Europe. Here, English wool met Italian dye, and the North Sea became a highway for goods and gossip alike. The merchants of Flanders were not warriors, but they wielded contracts like swords. They spoke a language of weights, measures, and interest rates, all written in cramped ink across parchment that smelled faintly of candle smoke and anxiety. To walk through Bruges in the 13th century was to hear a symphony of commerce. Bells tolling the opening of markets, the shout of traders hawking wine and cloth, the whisper of coins as they changed hands like secret prayers. And then there was Florence, proud, intellectual, beautiful Florence, where the Renaissance began not in art, but in accounting. Here, the Medici family transformed trade into empire and credit into control. Their counting houses stretched from London to Constantinople. They lent money to popes, kings, and artists alike, collecting both interest and influence. To the Florentines, risk was not a hazard but a tool. Every deal was a bet against time, and the cleverest merchants learned to make time itself pay dividends. But this prosperity was not without peril. The city offered freedom, but it demanded constant vigilance. A merchant might rise from obscurity to wealth in a decade, only to lose everything when a ship sank or a debtor defaulted. Fire, plague, and political upheaval could erase fortunes overnight. Gold was fickle, loyal only to movement. To stay rich, one had to remain in motion, trading, investing, calculating, scheming. In that sense, the city was alive, restless, feverish, and slightly mad. Unlike the static hierarchy of feudal estates, urban life was a spinning wheel. Everyone had a chance, but the wheel never stopped turning. Apprentices became masters, masters became bankers, and bankers became rulers of republics. Venice's doges were elected, not born. Florence's signoria was filled with merchants who, only generations earlier, had been humble cloth sellers. Even the church, ever practical, began to bless this new nobility. Monks once condemned greed. Now they collected rents from warehouses. Priests preached moderation while investing tithes in trade caravans. Holiness adapted, as it always did, to where the money flowed. For ordinary people, the city was a paradox. It smelled of sewage and cinnamon, of sweat and opportunity. Disease spread fast, but so did ideas. Artisans, scholars, and refugees mingled in taverns, sharing news from lands most would never see. The sound of the city was the sound of progress, not gentle, but insistent, like the hammering of a forge that refused to cool. Every day brought new risks: theft, fire, bankruptcy. But every risk smelled faintly of profit. In many ways, these medieval cities were the ancestors of modern stock markets. They birthed insurance contracts to protect cargo, bills of exchange to transfer money without carrying gold, and partnerships to spread the danger of loss. Even the language of finance, shares, bonds, credit, was born in these crowded streets, and with it came something even more revolutionary: the idea that fortune favored the bold, not the blessed. The merchant's life required both calculation and faith. Faith not in God, but in the sea, the market, and human greed. He prayed not for mercy, but for good winds and stable currency. He worshipped at the altar of opportunity. And when he succeeded, his wealth bought what even noble blood could not: respect earned, not inherited. Yet for all their progress, these cities were fragile kingdoms of trust. One broken promise could topple a dynasty. One rumor could sink a business. Banks rose and fell like tides, and every ledger carried the faint scent of fear beneath its ink. To walk through Florence at night was to see both splendor and ruin: palaces beside pawnshops, chapels beside brothels, candles burning beside debt, notices nailed to doors. Still, the city remained irresistible. For those who had been born on farms, tied to lords and seasons, its lights were miracles. Here, a man could choose his own master. Here, his worth was measured not by his birth, but by his bravery. And if he failed, well, failure at least was his own. The city offered something the countryside never could: agency. It was not safety that drew people in, but the intoxicating promise that tomorrow might change everything. By the late Middle Ages, the great trading hubs had reshaped the map of power. Wealth no longer flowed strictly through crowns or cathedrals, but through counting houses and docks. Kings borrowed from merchants, popes hired bankers. The balance of civilization tilted, ever so slightly, from divine right to economic might. It is tempting to romanticize these cities, to imagine Venetian merchants gazing nobly across the Adriatic, Florentine bankers counting coins beneath frescoed ceilings, Bruges canals glittering with starlight. But the truth was messier. The city was a gamble, a fever, a marketplace of miracles and misery alike. Fortunes were made by those who dared, and lost by those who blinked. And yet, without this restless energy, the world would never have escaped the mud of feudalism. The merchants of Venice and Florence were not heroes, but they were builders of ships, of systems, of something new. They turned risk into civilization, uncertainty into innovation, greed into growth. When the bells of Venice tolled at dusk, their sound was different from the church bells of the countryside. They did not mourn the end of a day. They celebrated the continuation of trade. In those echoes lay the pulse of a new world, one that believed, with a kind of reckless faith, that fortune itself could be forged, not inherited, not granted, but earned. And so, the city became both dream and danger, a place where a single coin could decide a destiny, and where the scent of spice meant both success and sin. In its crowded streets, humanity learned the oldest lesson of commerce, that to live richly, one must first be willing to risk everything. The city may have been the cradle of commerce, but the merchants were its restless soul, the wanderers who refused to stay put, who believed that fortune lay not in walls but in horizons. They were men of ledgers and instinct, mapmakers of money, whose footsteps stretched from the frost of Flanders to the dunes of Damascus. Their world was one of dust and daring, where a single deal could build a dynasty, and a single storm could erase it overnight. Picture a caravan winding through the Levant under the molten sun, camels groaning under bolts of silk, jars of saffron, and ingots of silver wrapped in wool. At night, the merchants gather around a small fire, whispering in a dozen languages: Arabic, Italian, Greek, Persian, all bound by the universal tongue of trade. Every one of them knows that the road to riches is lined with thieves, tariffs, and treachery. Yet they march on, because the reward at the journey's end glitters brighter than fear. In the medieval imagination, the merchant was a peculiar creature. To the nobility, he was useful but vulgar, a man who dirtied his hands with coin instead of blood. To the church, he was dangerous, walking too closely to the edge of sin. For what was trade, after all, if not a polite form of greed? And yet, to the world itself, the merchant was indispensable, the artery through which civilization's lifeblood flowed. Without them, spices never reached royal tables, manuscripts never crossed borders, and progress remained stuck in provincial mud. Their trade routes were nothing short of epic. Venetian galleys sailed for months through pirate waters to reach the Byzantine ports of Constantinople or the Levantine coast of Acre. From there, goods moved inland on camel caravans to Aleppo, Baghdad, or the distant markets of Samarkand and Kashgar, the Silk Road, a web of paths so ancient it seemed part of the earth's veins. At every stop, merchants negotiated not only prices but survival. They bribed officials, courted local rulers, and memorized rumors that might make or break them. The medieval merchant was half businessman, half diplomat, and half spy, a profession of thirds, in a world that offered no balance. Markets, in those days, were living organisms. They pulsed with heat and sound, ruled by gossip as much as by gold. A merchant's fortune could turn on the whisper of a plague in Cairo or a drought in Anatolia. News was as valuable as any cargo, and information flowed faster than ships. It was said that in Venice, a trader could ruin his rival merely by spreading a rumor about a shipwreck, whether or not it was true. Speculation, manipulation, and deceit were as old as the marketplace itself. Yet, despite this volatility, trade created something extraordinary, a network of trust in an age of suspicion. A Venetian could send a letter of credit to Damascus, and a banker there would honor it, trusting that both parchment and promise would hold. These were the ancestors of modern contracts, the first flickers of global finance. For the first time, wealth could move faster than men, and profit could be made without touching the goods themselves. The merchant had become both adventurer and accountant, an explorer of risk rather than land. What they traded was more than silk and spice. They dealt in imagination. Pepper from India, once worth its weight in gold, transformed kitchens across Europe. Nutmeg from the Banda Islands became a symbol of luxury, its scent lingering in the halls of kings. Amber from the Baltic adorned crosses and crowns. Lapis from Afghanistan colored the robes of the Virgin Mary in Florentine frescoes. Every exotic object carried a story of deserts crossed, storms survived, and dangers bribed into silence. To own such things was to own fragments of the world, but to earn them was another matter entirely. For every caravan that reached its destination, another was swallowed by the desert. Ships vanished into fog or flame, victims of pirates or hurricanes. A merchant's life was a balance between greed and fear, and most kept a confessor on retainer for when their luck ran out. Even the most hardened trader might pray before sailing, asking forgiveness in advance for the sins that profit required. In the great fairs of Champagne, where traders from across Europe met to barter wool for wine and silver for silk, the atmosphere was one of organized chaos. Languages collided like waves. Deals were struck with nods and winks. Merchants brought their goods and their secrets from every corner of the known world. A Genoese dealer might sell cloth dyed in Tyre's royal purple to a Flemish wool merchant, while a Jewish banker counted coins beneath the same awning. It was a small glimpse of globalization centuries before the word existed. The merchant's genius lay in calculation, not conquest. He conquered through patience, through knowing when to buy, when to hold, and when to flee. His weapons were scales and abacuses, his armor the art of persuasion, and though he carried no sword, his influence stretched farther than any knight's. Kings borrowed from him, popes blessed him, and towns grew rich around his warehouses. He was the silent architect of the new economy, the one who made the Middle Ages a little less medieval. And yet, his success carried its own curse. In a world that worshipped stability, the merchant thrived on motion. He could never rest, for stagnation meant death. Every fortune invited envy. Every voyage required a new gamble. When his ships returned, he sold the cargo before the ink on the ledger dried, reinvesting everything into the next expedition. His wealth was always somewhere else on the road, at sea, or in the hands of strangers he would never meet. He was also, inevitably, a spy. The line between trade and espionage was thin and often blurred by necessity. Merchants carried letters, maps, and intelligence between kingdoms. They knew which ports were blockaded, which rulers were sick, which soldiers were deserting. They listened to dockhands and captains, to monks and mercenaries. In a world without newspapers, the merchant's gossip was gold. Many a king relied on the reports of traders more than on his own diplomats. Knowledge, after all, was the only cargo that could never be taxed or stolen. The church, of course, frowned on this profession's ambiguity. Profit seemed perilously close to sin, and interest-bearing loans usury were condemned as theft in disguise. But as always, morality bent before necessity. The papacy itself depended on merchants to transport indulgences and tithes. Pilgrimages became business ventures. Relics were traded like stocks. The very road to heaven began to look suspiciously like a commercial route. In time, the merchant's influence became undeniable. The great families of Florence and Venice, the Medicis, the Fuggers, the Bardi, began as traders and ended as power brokers. They financed wars, funded cathedrals, and decided the fates of monarchs. Their ledgers became chronicles of empire, their credit lines stronger than armies. The age of feudal loyalty was quietly giving way to the age of contracts. Money, not birthright, had become the measure of power. Still, for every man who built an empire, there were 100 who lost everything. The sea was merciless, and markets even more so. A merchant might return to port rich beyond imagining, only to die weeks later of plague or betrayal. Others vanished into history without trace, their ships sunk, their names forgotten, their fortunes dissolved into legend. But their legacy endured, etched not in marble but in the invisible threads of commerce that connected one civilization to another. It is easy now to romanticize them, to imagine the medieval merchant as a dashing figure in fine robes, sipping wine in candlelit counting houses. In truth, they were exhausted men, who stank of salt and ink, whose fingers were blackened by coin and wax. They lived on the edge of ruin, sustained by ambition and the faint perfume of profit. Their courage was not the loud courage of warriors, but the quiet defiance of men who risked everything for an idea that wealth could be made, not merely inherited. They were, in a sense, the first citizens of a global world, men who knew that distance was just another kind of opportunity. And though they never called themselves capitalists, their instincts built the foundation of modern capitalism. Speculation, investment, diversification, debt, and the endless hunger for more. So when you think of the Middle Ages, don't picture only knights and castles. Think of a dusty caravan disappearing beyond the horizon. Think of a Venetian counting coins by lamplight, whispering prayers to both God and the sea. Think of the merchant, equal parts dreamer and schemer, whose courage was measured not in battles fought, but in risks taken. He was the quiet revolutionary of his age, the man who turned motion into money, rumor into empire, and uncertainty into the most valuable commodity of all. When the caravans finally reached the cities, when the silk was unrolled and the spices weighed, another kind of merchant was already waiting. One who never lifted a bale of cloth or sailed a ship, yet grew richer than all who did. He was the man of ledgers, the calculator of risks, the quiet alchemist who discovered how to make gold breathe. Banking, in the late Middle Ages, was not invented so much as it was summoned, born from the exhaustion of carrying wealth across dangerous lands, and from the realization that numbers, unlike men, could travel safely anywhere. It began modestly. In the markets of Florence and Siena, wool merchants found themselves drowning not in fabric, but in figures. Trade had become too vast for memory alone, so they began to record debts and credits in books, double-entry accounting, an invention so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it changed the very rhythm of wealth. For the first time, a man could owe money in one country and pay it in another, without ever touching a coin. A line of ink replaced a purse of gold, and in that stroke, civilization took a quiet step toward the modern world. The Medici family were not the first bankers, but they were the first to turn it into an empire. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, the family patriarch, began humbly as a cloth merchant. But he soon realized that there was more profit in handling other people's money than in weaving his own. By the time his grandson Cosimo inherited the business, the Medici name had spread across Europe like a signature. Their banking houses opened in Rome, Venice, Geneva, London, Avignon, each one a node in a shimmering web of gold threads that tied princes, popes, and pilgrims together. The Medici understood something few did, that money, like faith, relied on belief. A coin was only valuable because people agreed it was. A promise to pay could be just as powerful if enough people trusted it. Their genius was in nurturing that trust through reputation, precision, and the careful art of lending to everyone who mattered, and no one who could ruin them. They financed the Vatican, collected tithes for the church, and discreetly lent to monarchs who pretended that borrowing was beneath their dignity. In a way, their offices became cathedrals of arithmetic. Within them, men hunched over parchment, dipping quills into ink as they calculated the fate of nations. One column held credits, another debts, and between them in the margin lived the invisible heartbeat of profit. The Medici understood that wealth could be both infinite and imaginary. It simply had to circulate. Gold, once hoarded, was dead. But when loaned, when invested, it multiplied like a living thing. The church called it usury, the sin of making money from money. The Bible forbade charging interest after all. Time belonged to God, and no man had the right to sell it. But medieval bankers were practical theologians. They renamed interest compensatio, a fee for risk. They argued that since they could lose money, it was fair to charge for the danger. Theologians frowned but accepted it, as long as the banker confessed before death. Thus, morality adjusted itself neatly to economics, as it so often does. It was a strange marriage, sin and salvation written in the same ink. The popes themselves began to depend on the very institutions they condemned. When crusades needed financing, when cathedrals required marble, or when rival claimants to the papal throne needed armies, they turned to the bankers. The Medici Bank became the church's unofficial treasury. The irony was exquisite. Gold that was born in sin built the very altars of redemption. And it was not just the Medicis. Across Europe, other dynasties rose from the counting table. The Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence controlled more wealth than some kingdoms, loaning vast sums to Edward III of England, who, predictably, never paid them back. His default bankrupted their houses and sent ripples through every market in Europe. It was a painful lesson. Even gold could be devoured by politics. Yet out of their failure came wisdom banks diversified, spreading risk across borders. inventing systems of credit, bills of exchange, and partnerships that made future collapses survivable. Soon, money began to move faster than men. A merchant in Bruges could order silk from Genoa and pay with a piece of paper that promised gold in Florence. A French knight could mortgage his estate without leaving his chateau. Money became a whisper, an idea, a promise carried by couriers instead of carts. In a world still lit by torchlight, this was magic. The banker had replaced the alchemist. He did not need to transmute lead into gold, only to persuade the world that his paper was as good as either. But such power came at a price. Bankers lived on the edge of admiration and hatred. To kings, they were necessary evils. To peasants, shadowy manipulators. They were blamed for famines, wars, and even the weather. "The devil counts coins in Florence," wrote one priest, and the clinking echoes all the way to Rome. Yet their influence was impossible to deny. The Medici's fortune financed artists like Botticelli, architects like Brunelleschi, and philosophers who would later ignite the Renaissance. The wealth born of wool and ink transformed culture itself, proof that beauty, too, could be an investment. Inside the Medici palace, amid frescoed ceilings and perfumed halls, the family gathered each evening to review accounts. Their ledgers were as sacred as scripture. The margins bore small notes in Latin prayers, calculations, and sometimes warnings. "Do not lend to those who cannot repay," one reads. "Do not anger the Pope. Do not trust a prince who smiles." It was not cynicism, but realism. For bankers knew better than anyone that power was a debtor's game. Florence itself became a monument to finance. The great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore rose, not from divine intervention, but from interest payments. Every coin laid into its foundations carried the fingerprint of a merchant or a banker who had once been called sinful. And perhaps that was the truest miracle of all, that faith and finance, so often at odds, could conspire to create something eternal. Beyond Italy, the idea spread. In Germany, the Fuggers of Augsburg built a financial network that rivaled the Medicis. Jakob Fugger the Rich, a man whose very name seemed to mock humility, bankrolled emperors and popes alike. His loans secured the election of Charles V, effectively buying an empire with ink. He owned mines, fleets, and entire cities. When accused of greed, he replied simply, "I do not wish to own the world, only its interest." Oy! Through families like the Fuggers and Medicis, Europe learned a new principle, that wealth was not finite. The old feudal world believed riches were carved from the earth and divided among men. The bankers proved it could be created from trust alone. A contract, a calculation, a cleverly worded promise, these were new kinds of treasure, invisible yet immensely real. The economy became not a field to harvest, but a tide to ride. Still, even in prosperity, fear lingered. The church's suspicion never disappeared entirely. To die rich was dangerous to the soul. So many bankers sought redemption through patronage. They paid for hospitals, orphanages, and monasteries, buying forgiveness one chapel at a time. Their tombs were modest compared to their fortunes, as if they hoped humility could balance the ledgers of heaven. But history remembers them not for their piety, but for their precision for teaching the world that money, like faith, grows strongest when believed in. By the end of the 15th century, banking had become the unseen empire of Europe. Wars were won or lost in counting houses, not on battlefields. Monarchs depended on credit. Merchants lived on speculation. The great irony of the medieval world was that the age most obsessed with God had quietly invented the modern god of money. And through it all, one truth endured, the one carved, perhaps, above the door of every Florentine bank, and whispered in every marketplace from Venice to Bruges: gold never sleeps. It simply changes hands. It passes from king to banker, from merchant to priest, from sinner to saint, always moving, always restless, like history itself. And those who learn to follow its motion, Those who understand the rhythm of its endless circulation find themselves, in every age, standing quietly at the heart of power. By the time the Medici and the Fuggers had mastered the art of making money multiply, one grim truth had already been carved into the ledger of medieval finance. Never, under any circumstances, lend to a king. A merchant might cheat you, a noble might default, but a king could kill you, seize your books, and declare himself righteous for doing so. In the Middle Ages, royal bankruptcy did not end with bankruptcy courts. It ended with bonfires and beheadings. The Templars learned this lesson better than anyone, and they learned it in flame. Once, they were the most powerful organization in Christendom. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon Knights, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, had somehow become the bankers of Europe. It began innocently enough. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land could deposit money at a Templar preceptory in London or Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem, carrying a letter of credit instead of a purse full of coins. It was safer, faster, and far more civilized than being robbed along the way. Before long, kings themselves began to notice the convenience. By the 13th century, the Templars were no longer just crusaders. They were accountants in chainmail. They owned farms, vineyards, and entire fleets of ships. They minted coins and stored treasure in their fortified vaults. Their Paris headquarters functioned as Europe's central bank. Kings deposited their war chests there. Queens pawned jewels for dowries, and merchants borrowed to fund expeditions. Their white mantles with red crosses became symbols not of holiness, but of solvency. Among their most devoted clients was King Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, though his fairness did not extend to his debts. He borrowed enormous sums from the Templars to finance his endless wars with England and Flanders, and when the bills came due, he found himself faced with an unholy dilemma: repay them or destroy them. And so, in true royal fashion, he chose both. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, Philip struck. Across France, Templar knights were arrested at dawn, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and unspeakable sins. The charges were absurd: worshipping idols, spitting on the cross, consorting with demons, yet they served their purpose. Under torture, confessions flowed like blood. The order's assets were seized, its leaders imprisoned, and its wealth conveniently transferred to the crown. What had begun as a loan ended as a liquidation by fire. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was burned alive in 1314, tied to a stake on the Ile de la Cité as the Seine reflected the flames. He was said to have cursed both Philip and Pope Clement V, who had colluded in his downfall, summoning them to divine judgment within a year. Legend says he was right. Both were dead within 12 months. But curses did not restore the gold, nor the order, nor the trust that had once fueled the Templar network. Their crime had not been heresy. It had been competence. They had learned to manage money better than kings could, and in medieval Europe, that was unforgivable. Philip's theft was hardly unique. Throughout the Middle Ages, kings treated banks as convenient piggy banks, and when the coffers ran dry, they simply changed the rules. Edward III of England borrowed heavily from the Florentine banking houses of the Bardi and the Peruzzi to fund his wars against France. When the cost of his ambitions outstripped even Florentine patience, Edward did what monarchs often did best. He defaulted. The two banks collapsed, dragging much of Italy's economy with them. Thousands were ruined. But Edward continued his wars, his conscience untroubled. In a world without regulation or recourse, royal debt was an act of faith. To lend to a monarch was to lend to God's anointed, or so the contracts claimed. But faith did not pay interest. When monarchs could not repay, they declared their debts immoral, illegal, or inspired by the devil. The king's word is law, one clerk wrote dryly, and therefore his silence is bankruptcy. Money, in such times, was both power and peril. The closer a banker got to the throne, the more fragile his neck became. To finance a king was to dance with a wolf in velvet, flattering, magnificent, and always hungry. When things went well, you were called a genius. When they didn't, you were called a traitor. The Templars' fall set a precedent: violence as financial policy. A few centuries later, when Henry VIII of England found his treasury strained, he followed Philip's example in another form. Instead of destroying bankers, he destroyed monasteries, seizing their lands and gold under the pretext of reform. Once again, religion and finance proved indistinguishable when it came to royal greed. The king's coffers swelled, the church's influence waned, and history repeated its favorite lesson: never store your fortune in someone else's conscience. Even the mightiest of bankers understood this danger. The Medici, for all their brilliance, treaded carefully around royal clients. They lent modestly, insisted on collateral, and preferred popes to kings, for popes, though capricious, were less likely to send soldiers to renegotiate. Yet even they fell prey to political shifts. When the French invaded Italy in 1494, the Medici Bank collapsed, its branches seized, its accounts frozen, its empire of trust undone by the same kind of royal opportunism that had once consumed the Templars. Royal bankruptcy was not an accounting problem, it was a death sentence. Bankers could not sue a king. There were no courts to enforce a debt against the sovereign. The only court that mattered was the one held by torchlight, where parchment was burned and creditors disappeared. And so, banking evolved to survive tyranny. It learned secrecy, diversification, and the subtle art of lending indirectly. Merchants no longer lent to monarchs, they lent to intermediaries, or to armies, or to entire nations. Money grew cautious, clever, and invisible. In a sense, this was the birth of modern finance, born from fear, not ambition. The invisible hand was not the markets. It was the trembling hand of a banker, hiding his gold where no king could find it. Offshore accounts existed long before the Caribbean. They were hidden in monasteries, in coded letters, in double books. The rich learned to disguise wealth as piety, as charity, even as architecture. You could not confiscate what you could not see. The tragedy of the Templars haunted the collective imagination for centuries. Some believed their treasure survived, buried or spirited away to Scotland or Cyprus. Others whispered that their knowledge of finance lived on in the secret dealings of later banks, that the true revenge of the Templars was teaching Europe how to protect wealth from power. But the deeper lesson was simpler and darker. In the Middle Ages, finance was warfare by other means, and in war, the crown always claimed victory. When a king smiled, the wise banker bowed not from respect, but from survival. For all their castles and crosses, rulers of the medieval world had little understanding of economics beyond the immediate gratification of conquest. A treasury was not to be balanced but emptied. A debt was not to be honored but conquered. Kings treated money the way they treated land, something to seize, not to sustain. And yet, without the daring of those who risked lending to them, the world might never have learned the paradox of credit, that prosperity requires trust, even when trust is deadly. The Templars, the Bardi, the Medici, each fell victim to the same illusion. That reason could tame royalty. It never could. As centuries passed, finance adapted, wearing thicker armor. Governments would one day replace kings. Bonds would replace pledges, and armies would be funded by signatures instead of swords. But in the age of crowns and crosses, the cost of lending to power was paid in blood, not bankruptcy. And so if you imagine a medieval banker by candlelight, quill trembling in hand, remember, every stroke of ink was a prayer that the man he served would not decide to pay him with fire. For in those days, wealth was not just fleeting, it was flammable. Gold never slept, yes, but when lent to kings, it often went up in smoke. By the time Europe was still arguing over whether charging interest offended God, across the sands of the Sahara, a man rose whose wealth made popes look poor and kings look like beggars in crowns. His name was Mansa Musa, Emperor of Mali, Lord of gold and salt, ruler of a realm so vast that its edges blurred into legend. Historians would later try to measure his fortune they gave up. Economists would attempt to convert it into modern currency. The numbers broke their calculators. The truth was simpler. He was so rich that money itself bent around him like light around the Sunday. If the Middle Ages had saints of war and saints of faith, Musa was its saint of fortune. His empire, born in the red earth of West Africa, rested atop the richest gold fields the medieval world had ever known. In the mines of Bambouk and Bure, laborers dug glittering veins from the soil, not in coins or bars, but in raw chunks the size of fists. The dust of those mines gilded everything it touched: robes, temples, even the wind. Gold was not rare in Mali. It was elemental, as ordinary to them as rain was to England. Musa inherited this abundance in 1312, after the mysterious disappearance of his predecessor, a ruler who had, according to chroniclers, sailed west across the Atlantic with 2,000 ships and never returned. Where that fleet went, no one knows. But Musa stayed, and in staying, he transformed wealth into power. Under his reign, the Mali Empire became a constellation of cities: Timbuktu, Gao, and Niani, bound together by trade routes that pulsed like arteries through the desert. Salt flowed north, slaves east, scholars west, and gold, always gold in every direction. For years, Musa ruled quietly, content to tax caravans and sponsor scholars. But then came the journey that would immortalize him and ruin economies in the process. In 1324, he decided to perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca required of all Muslims who could afford it. He could afford it. He could afford 10 lifetimes of it. So when Mansa Musa set out, he did not travel like a pilgrim. He traveled like a phenomenon. Imagine the scene: a caravan stretching farther than the horizon, its advance shimmering like heat itself. There were tens of thousands of attendants, soldiers, and servants, some say 60,000 men. 100 camels carried gold, each burdened with hundreds of pounds of it. The procession moved slowly, like an empire uprooted, crossing the Sahara not in desperation but in majesty. Wherever it passed, the air smelled of dust and perfume, and the sun glinted off gold, as if heaven itself were taking notice. The chronicles say that when Musa reached Cairo, Egypt had never seen anything like it. The Sultan welcomed him with ceremony, but soon realized the visit was no ordinary one. Musa gave gifts of gold so freely to officials, merchants, musicians, even beggars in the streets, that within weeks the value of gold collapsed. Prices soared, currencies faltered. The Cairo dinar lost its stability for more than a decade. In modern terms, it was the world's first case of hyperinflation by generosity. To the people of Cairo, he was both miracle and menace. They watched him pray in mosques, distribute charity by the chestful, and endow scholars with fortunes that would shame universities. Yet they also cursed him in the same breath, for his gifts had turned their economy into chaos. It was said that Musa could buy a kingdom by accident, merely by tipping too much. But to Musa, wealth was never hoarded. It was divine, a blessing to be displayed as proof of faith and fortune alike. He saw no sin in magnificence, only the reflection of God's favor. In Mecca, he donated so much gold to the poor and to holy sites that travelers began to speak his name with awe and disbelief. Word spread back to Europe through traders and geographers, and soon, maps began to change. On the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most famous medieval world maps, there sits an image of Mansa Musa, robed in gold, holding a golden orb as if it were the Sunday. The caption calls him the King of Mali, the richest and most noble lord in all the land. And yet even divinity has its burdens. On his return journey, Musa passed again through Cairo, this time poorer, at least in gold. To restore balance to the markets he had broken, He borrowed back gold at high interest from Egyptian merchants. Imagine that, the richest man in the world, borrowing money because he had given too much away. It was an act both humble and absurd, the kind of paradox that only the truly wealthy can afford. When he returned to Mali, he did not seek more conquest. Instead, he sought to build. Under his rule, Timbuktu became a city of scholars and scribes, home to the Sankore University, a marvel of African intellect, where thousands of manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and theology were written and copied. He imported architects from Andalusia to design mosques, palaces, and libraries. The Jingareber Mosque, built in sun-baked clay and carved with timber beams, still stands today, a monument not of greed but of grandeur. Musa's wealth was not wasted on idle pleasure. It built bridges of knowledge across continents. Yet, ironically, it was his generosity, not his conquests, that defined his legend. The medieval world, obsessed with scarcity, could not comprehend such abundance. European chroniclers whispered that his gold was infinite, that he possessed the philosopher's stone, or that he had discovered the river of paradise. But the truth was less mystical and more moral. Musa showed what happens when fortune becomes faith. His story was a mirror held up to every kingdom that worshiped gold. In his hands, wealth looked divine, yet it carried the same corruption it always had. Gold that feeds too freely becomes poison. His pilgrimage was meant to prove piety. Instead, it proved that even holiness can drown in excess. Economies trembled not because he stole, but because he gave. And that was the cruel lesson of the Middle Ages. Power, even the purest kind, distorts everything it touches. For centuries after his death, stories of Mansa Musa persisted, of cities paved with gold, of rivers that gleamed beneath the moon. In Europe, cartographers and explorers dreamed of reaching Mali's riches. It fueled the fever that would later send ships westward, chasing the phantom of African gold, the same lust that would birth the age of exploration, and, with it, new empires of greed. Musa himself never saw the irony. He died around 1337, leaving behind an empire at its zenith and a legend that outlived it. Within a few generations, Mali fractured under weaker rulers. The mines still glittered, but the spirit that bound them, that strange fusion of faith and fortune, had faded. Gold had made the empire, but it could not save it. And so his name passed into myth, half history, half parable. He became a symbol not of greed, but of the fine line between abundance and ruin. When people today speak of the richest man who ever lived, they imagine palaces and treasures beyond comprehension. But the truer image is quieter. A man standing in a desert, sunlight bouncing off gold dust in the wind, wondering how something so beautiful could weigh so much. In the end, Mansa Musa's story closed the Middle Ages' greatest lesson. Wealth was never merely fortune. It was temptation in a shining disguise. Gold built empires and burned them alike. It elevated kings and erased orders. It made popes kneel and beggars dream. In every age, it promised safety but delivered struggle. And as the fires of the Templars faded and the counting houses of Florence fell silent, the desert wind carried one final whisper, perhaps the oldest truth of them all. Gold is never possessed. It only passes through hands, glittering briefly, before it moves on. The story of medieval riches ends, as most stories of power do, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. By candlelight, it glitters. By daylight, it stains. Every coin that changed hands in the Middle Ages carried fingerprints not only of those who spent it, but of those who suffered for it. Wealth, then, was never clean. It dripped with sweat from the fields, with blood from battlefields, and with incense from altars where the rich begged forgiveness for having too much. For every noble who feasted beneath banners of velvet, 100 peasants bent beneath skies of mud. For every merchant counting profits in gold, there were sailors drowned, miners buried, and artisans forgotten. The Middle Ages may have called wealth a blessing from God, but to many, It must have felt like a curse carved into the bones of the poor. And yet, in that same brutal world, ambition endured. Stubborn, radiant, human, people still dreamed of climbing beyond their birth, even when the ladder was greased with impossibility. To rise from nothing took cunning, luck, and often sin disguised as virtue. A single good harvest, a successful voyage, a loan repaid instead of revoked, such things were miracles in their own right. But staying rich required something else: balance. Too much greed, and you met the gallows; too little, and you faded back into the mud. Even kings had to walk that narrow bridge between indulgence and divine wrath, hoping the church would bless their excesses before it condemned them. If there was one truth in that age, it was this: the system was designed for its architects. The church prayed for itself. The nobles fought for themselves, and the peasants worked for everyone else. The divine order that priests preached was simply a hierarchy wrapped in holy words. And though centuries have passed, the pattern lingers. We measure wealth now in digits and zeros, in portfolios and market caps, but the rhythm is the same. A few build towers, while the many hold them up. In the Middle Ages, inequality was written on parchment. Today, it glows from screens. The ink and the algorithms may differ, but the story is unchanged. The rich still win, and the poor still work. Still, it is worth remembering that even in a world that worshipped gold, not everything bowed to it. Amid the greed, there were builders who sought beauty, monks who preserved knowledge, and traders who carried more than silk, they carried ideas. Out of that cruel, glittering age came cathedrals, manuscripts, and music, all forged by hands that never touched the wealth they inspired. Now, the market square empties, the last voices fade, the forge cools to ash, and the bells of vespers echo through the dusk. Somewhere, a merchant locks his chest and whispers a prayer that tomorrow's deals will favor him. Somewhere else, a peasant counts 3 copper coins, enough for a loaf and nothing more. And somewhere far above them both, a king dreams of vaults he'll never live long enough to spend. The world of the Middle Ages was brutal, beautiful, and terribly human. A reminder that gold can build as easily as it destroys, that fortune and faith are forever intertwined, and that behind every empire's wealth lies a trail of quiet suffering. So, if you're still awake, thank you for wandering through these muddy roads of medieval ambition with me. Like, share, and subscribe, and may your dreams tonight be warm, gentle, and far freer than the lives of those who built the golden ages we remember.